Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tara Lynn Johnson, and I am the Clinical Research Education Program Coordinator. And today we have our two hosts who will be speaking on our topic of IRB reliance. And we have Stephanie Falwell and Janae Evans from the IRB. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, and she's going to kick us off.
Hi everyone, so can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, and it's the right one, Tara?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to welcome everyone. Like Tara had said, Janae Evans, who is our IRB Reliance Analyst, and I have been working on this presentation so that we can present to you all about, when somebody goes up to you and says, I need a reliance, what do I do? Specifically for reliance studies when UC Davis is the IRB of record. If you're not familiar what that term means, IRB of record, we will be going over some terminology at the beginning. But first, we're going to do a quick poll. So 1 second. So just do a little bit of a temperature check. This will give us a good idea of how much experience this Zoom room has with reliance agreements when UC Davis is the IRB of record. We're just going to ask you, have you worked with the UC Davis IRB on a study where at least one outside institution, so UCSF, Duke, University of Narnia, any other outside institution has ceded review to the UC Davis IRB? So we'll just give everyone a few seconds to answer that question, and then we'll release the poll results. It looks like about half of you have voted so far, and this is our only poll for the day, so not too bad. Okay, looks like just the last responses are trickling in, so I'm going to actually end the poll and release the results. Oh, whoops. So hopefully everyone can see them. Can everyone see the poll results?
Yes.
Okay, so it looks like about 42% of people have never been involved in a study where at least one external IRB has ceded review to the UC Davis IRB. And we have about a few people, about 6, who have done so only once. We have more than I thought we would, about 11 people who have done so a few times, so our experts. And then we have about 2 people who said that they weren't quite sure. So this is a good mix of people, and regardless of your experience level, you are in the right place as far as this presentation goes. So like I said, we're going to start out with some terminology. So the first term that I wanted to define is actually what is a reliance agreement. So the reliance agreement is a formal written agreement that allows one institution to delegate IRB review to an IRB affiliated with another institution. So the reliance agreement is the actual written contract that allows one institution to permit another institution's IRB to shoulder the responsibility of IRB review. Now, another term that you're going to hear a lot is single IRB or SIRB. And that's when one IRB conducts reviews on behalf of all or some participating sites in a multi-site study. So this term exists because in 2018, the federal regulations for human subjects research were updated. This is what oftentimes is referred to as the revised common rule. And one of the biggest changes of this update, which went into effect in 2020, was what is called the single IRB mandate or SIRB mandate. And this mandate requires non-exempt human subjects research funded by certain federal agencies and departments to be reviewed by a single IRB. So that's where that term comes from. So that single IRB is actually reviewing for other IRBs, and there's a name for that. And that's called your reviewing IRB or your IRB of record, which is exactly what we're talking about in this presentation. So that's an IRB that assumes IRB review responsibilities for another institution or external personnel. Now, in contrast, if you have a reviewing IRB, that means you have to have a relying IRB. So that's an IRB which has ceded IRB review to another IRB for a specific study or set of studies. So just to visualize what we're talking about today, you have some sort of external IRB. So UCSF, Duke, any other institution, which will be ceding review to the UC Davis IRB. So this is the simplest setup with only one relying IRB, but we'll go into a setup where you can have multiple IRBs in a second. This means that the UC Davis IRB is acting as the IRB of record or the reviewing IRB, and the external IRB is the relying IRB. So like I said, this is the most simple form of this sort of setup. However, you can have something a little bit more complicated with the UC Davis IRB being the IRB of record, and then one external IRB that's ceding review to UC Davis, and then another external IRB and another external IRB ad nauseum. So as many external sites who want to rely on UC Davis as needed. And these are all considered relying IRBs. And once again, UC Davis IRB is the IRB of record or the reviewing IRB. So we're pretty much all on the same page here. There's one last term that I want to define, which is local context. So local context is any required state or local laws, institutional policies, and community expectations to be followed where human subjects research will be conducted. So an example of local context at UC Davis is the California state requirement to provide the experimental subjects Bill of Rights to any person who takes part in a medical experiment. And guess what? The definition of medical experiment is also defined specifically by the state of California in this instance. And so that is a very local context. And then provision of the Experimental Subjects Bill of Rights, in contrast, is not required by every state. Now I can see that we have some sort of question or something in the chat. We're going to stop for questions shortly, and then we're going to show a video, and then we're going to stop for questions again, and then we'll do some questions at the end, just so everyone knows, because I have a feeling that a lot of people's questions are going to get answered as we're moving through these different slides. So we had several questions at the very beginning when people were asked, what do they want to learn about reliance agreements? And that was, when do I actually need to do a reliance agreement? So why rely? One reason is that you have a study that is receiving federal funding. So if a study is a multi-site study and its funding is being provided through a federal agency that has signed on to that revised common rule that I mentioned before, then that single IRB or SIRB requirement is in place, and you will need to have one single IRB assume responsibility for IRB review. So this is a situation in which this is absolutely required. You have a non-exempt study, it's a multi-site, and it's funded by a funding agency, a federal agency rather, that has signed on to that revised common rule. So you can Google a list of common rule agencies. DHHS will be the first hit that you'll get, and they will have a whole list. They have a whole table of which of the 17 different agencies that have signed on to the revised common rule, but those include the ones that we see most often here at UC Davis, at least, are DHHS, so Department of Health and Human Services, which covers the NIH, the Department of Defense, and NSF. Those are the most common ones we see here. Now, if your study is not receiving federal funding, but you have a large number of sites, and you may still want to enter into a reliance agreement. This is especially true if you anticipate having to submit a lot of modifications for your study as time progresses. So just to recap, multi-site plus federal funding by a common rule agency means you have to have a reliance. If you have a study that is not funded by one of those agencies, but you have a large number of sites, then you may want to still pursue a reliance agreement, but it's by no means required. So why would you not rely? One reason, if you remember before, we said that the study has to be non-exempt. So if your research is exempt, it does not qualify for a reliance agreement. That's even if it is funded by one of those common rule federal agencies that we had just talked about. Another instance is if UC Davis is not engaged in the research. So for example, we're analyzing some de-identified MRIs or something like that, then we will also not enter into a reliance agreement. And once again, this applies even if a federal agency is the one that is funding this study. And then lastly, reliance agreements cannot be initiated outside of the United States. So to be clear, because this does come up, if you have a federally funded multi-site non-exempt study, and for example, one of your sites is in Canada, you would be expected to have a reliance agreement in place only for the United States sites. However, the Canadian site is not able to enter into that reliance agreement. their own IRB, or I guess in Canada, they use the term Institutional Ethics Board, or IEC, is going to be responsible for that Canadian site's IRB review. So all the United States sites, they'll be having a reliance agreement in place. Canadian site, they're on their own. They are responsible for their own IRB review. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how do you actually get your reliance off the ground. So the first step we're going to talk about is the initial submission, because you have to get approved. So that first step is you're going to request a consultation with the UC Davis IRB Reliance team. So who's responsible for that step? That's you. The UC Davis study team is going to be the one that's going to initiate that contact. What are you going to do? You're going to email hs-irbreliance@ucdavis.edu to request a consultation. Now, what should that email include? That email should include the study title, the funding source, the funding status. So are you still seeking funding, or have you already gotten your funding? Who the UC Davis PI is going to be, the list of expected relying institutions. So this is not a hard and fast, these are exactly the sites that are going to be in our study, but these are the ones that we are thinking about having participate with us. A study protocol, or some sort of summary of the protocol if a official study protocol is not available. And lastly, a description of collaborator activities. This is especially important if not every site within your reliance is conducting the same sorts of procedures. So if one site is doing half of the study and another site is doing another half of the study, then it's important to say, okay, well, UC Davis is doing XYZ, and University of Oregon is doing ABC. So it is important to let kind of help the reliance team get the lay of the land. So the next step, the second step, and there are only 8, is reliance team consultation. So you've reached out, and now the reliance team is going to respond to you. So they're the ones who are responsible for this step. What are they going to do during this step? They're going to determine, are you even eligible for a reliance? Because we just went over a bunch of examples where this might not be the case. They're going to provide guidance for how to submit to the IRB. They're going to start initiating reliance agreements. And another important part of this step is that the reliance team will see if there's any sort of pre-existing agreements that exist with the outside institutions or institution involved. So sometimes we have agreements with other institutions that cover multiple studies and not just one. So this is an important part of that step as well, and something that the reliance team is responsible for. So once the reliance team has consulted with you, they're going to start getting you set up on IRBnet. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit weird and deviate, especially from what we do as normal practice when we're using IRBnet. So the reliance team is going to actually be responsible for this. And the procedure here is they're going to set up the study in IRBnet using what's called the multi-site feature. And from here on out, it's going to be really important that you're keeping track of what needs to happen in which projects. So I'll explain what that means in just a second. So the reliance team is going to set up the study-wide project. So that's the project that's going to act as an umbrella for all the other sites that are participating in this actual study, this multi-site study. So the UC Davis IRB Reliance team will then give themselves access to the study-wide project on IRBnet. And then they're going to create the UC Davis project. So this is where I was saying you really need to keep track of what's happening where, because you have a study-wide project and you have a UC Davis project. And later on, we're going to have other sites projects. And then the UC Davis project is linked to the study-wide project by the Reliance team. So it's starting to add links onto that umbrella, and we're building the study out in IRBnet. Okay, so that fourth step. So the study-wide and the UC Davis initial submissions are completed. So who's responsible for that? That's going to be the UC Davis study team. So that's you guys. The procedure for the study-wide project, there's going to be no initial review application. And then you're going to attach any documents that apply to all sites. So that's any protocols that apply to all sites, data collection tools, surveys, anything that every site is going to use. And the UC Davis principal investigator is going to sign this package. Now for the UC Davis project, you are going to have an initial review application. And that initial review application is going to be specific to UC Davis. It has nothing to do with the other sites yet. It's just, what are we doing here at UC Davis? any sort of documents that apply only to UC Davis. So some examples of that would be, a UC Davis specific consent document or sort of ancillary approvals that you need to get. The UC Davis principal investigator signature is also going to be included in this package. And then lastly, the department chair signature. So not too different from the normal IRB review process. It's just that weird kind of study-wide project that is a little bit different. So step 5 of 8 is going to be that the study-wide and UC Davis projects are approved. So who is responsible for that? That's the UC Davis IRB and the UC Davis study team. And so this is identical to the normal IRB process. And so it is important that the reason why I included the UC Davis study team in this step is because just make sure that you're replying to us through IRBnet and really being accessible so that we can get things through as quickly as possible. Now I have a hot tip here, which is to make sure that you are replying to the correct project. Do not get your wires crossed. If the IRB reaches out to you through the study-wide umbrella project, then you need to respond via that study-wide umbrella project in project mail. Don't respond to the UC Davis one because then you have your wires crossed. Respond where the question was asked. I guess that's a really common mistake. So just make sure that you're really staying on top of, okay, this was this IRBnet number. This is the study-wide one. Oh, okay, this is the UC Davis project. This is the UC Davis project's IRB number. Don't get your wires crossed. Just try to keep everything straight. Now, the next step is that relying sites are going to be set up in IRBnet. So who's responsible for that? That's also the UC Davis IRB Reliance team. The procedure is for non-UC Davis site-specific projects to be set up in IRBnet, like one at a time. A blank initial review application is going to be created. So this is important. The Reliance team will not complete the initial review application for each site, but they do have to create it because external sites do not have access to our forms on IRBnet. They're also going to create a dummy post-approval submission form. And this is actually exactly why that post-approval submission form is being created, even though it's not going to be used. It's just a proactive way to give the relying sites access to the form for any future post-approval submissions. So it's just really getting them set up for success, but it's not something that we think that they will fill out in this particular submission. Okay, and the 7th step, so the relying sites will complete their submission. So who is responsible? That would be the external sites. So the Reliance team, along with the UC Davis study team, especially if there's a strong lead research coordinator at UC Davis, will help the external site study teams with figuring out like what needs to be uploaded exactly to IRBnet. But we do provide some assistance with that. It's really important that those lines of communication are kept open. So the procedures for this in the non-UC Davis site-specific projects, that could be UC Irvine and some other site, they will complete their initial review application specific to that site. Once again, it should only include information. If it's for UC Irvine, it should only include UC Irvine specific information. And it should also only include documents that apply only to that specific site. So these are some that are required. The site-specific document, or if they are just using an addendum to the umbrella consent form, then that would be included there. The site-specific principal investigator's CV should be included. The site and principal investigator's signature should also be included. And now we're going to go into some things that are sometimes required, which is where it's important to be talking to the Reliance team about what actually needs to get uploaded. So Reliance agreement documents are sometimes required. HIPAA authorizations are sometimes required, especially if they're separate from the ICF or informed consent form at that site, and a local advertisement if it's only being used at that site. So just to really hammer home why it's important to work with the Reliance team, or for external sites rather, to work with the Reliance team on this, is that with the Reliance agreement documents, they're only sometimes required because it really depends on if a blanket Reliance agreement is already in place. And only the Reliance team is really going to know if that's true. That's not something that you as a clinical research coordinator or clinical research nurse are going to necessarily know off the top of your head. And then lastly, our last step, the relying site projects get approved. So who's responsible for that? UC Davis IRB and external sites, because they should be working with us. The procedure for that is that a Reliance agreement must first be in place. So I included this card from Monopoly. Do not pass go. You will not be able to pass go unless that Reliance agreement is actually in place. Nothing will move forward until that happens. So it's really important that you're keeping on top of which agreements are already in place and which ones are still in progress. For that study-wide project, once again, that's that umbrella project, you're going to make any necessary updates that need to be made to that study-wide project. So, for example, if the overall arching consent form has the PI names for every institution that's participating in that reliance agreement, that multi-site study, then you are going to have to add the PI name to the study-wide ICF at that time. So this is when these sorts of changes happen. Any sort of, I guess you could say like retroactive changes to the actual study-wide project. If no changes are needed, the Reliance team will actually create an empty study-wide package so that approval letters can be updated with the new external PI. But that's not something that you have to worry about as a coordinator. And then lastly, the relying sites will get access to the study-wide project upon approval. So this is a time when it's really important for the UC Davis coordinator to also kind of be helping other sites and helping with the process, especially if there's limited study staff at those other sites. So it helps to have a strong coordinator who is responsible for really helping with this part of this project. So at this point, we're actually going to do a demonstration. Janae Evans, one of our Reliance analysts, recorded a presentation or a video about actually how this process works on IRB-Net. So we're going to transition to that now. So just give me a second to fix my screen. And also questions. This is when we're supposed to stop for questions. So Janae, take it away for any questions or in the chat or anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask any questions.
I think Eric had a question. You're asking about the percentage of relying IRBs who use the UCD IRB or who are using UC Davis IRB as the IRB of record, who use the Smart IRB system. I wanted to clarify, are you talking about the online Reliance system or are you talking about the Smart IRB agreement? Because they're two different, related but different things.
The Smart IRB system.
So the online Reliance, Smart
Correct.
IRB online Reliance system, when we're the IRB of record, we don't use it because we have IRB-Net and it sends all the notifications out.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Feel free to put any other questions in the chat or unmute yourself. Well, it doesn't look like we're gonna have any other questions, Stephanie, if you're ready. Completing the study-wide package in IRB-Net. After you receive the email from the Reliance team notifying you that the study-wide and UC Davis packages are ready, log into IRB-Net. The study-wide and UC Davis packages are usually near the top of the list, but you can always search using the IRB-Net ID numbers the Reliance team provided. Click on the link for the study-wide package. You will land on the project overview page. This page gives you information on the package and project status. Since this package has not been submitted, it is listed as work in progress. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you will see a list of the projects that are linked for this study. Right now, there's the study-wide project that is marked as the lead site and the UC Davis project. As more sites are added, their projects and statuses will appear on this list. To add documents to your package, go to the Designer page. The navigation button is found on the left-hand side of the screen. Once on the Designer page, you will upload documents using the Attach New Document button at the bottom of the screen. You can either upload documents one at a time or select multiple to upload at the same time. Using the drop-down, select the document type for each document uploaded. You can find a list of how to categorize documents on our new projects webpage under Upload Documents to IRB-Net. After all documents have been uploaded to the package, the UC Davis PI needs to sign the package. The PI should log into IRB-Net, open this package, click the Sign This Package button on the left-hand side of the screen, select Principal Investigator from the drop-down, and then click Sign. Please note, we don't allow another person to sign on behalf of the PI. After the PI has signed the study-wide package, the package can be submitted to our IRB by clicking the Submit This Package button on the left-hand side of the screen. By default, the UC Davis IRB is selected. Click Continue. For submission type, select New Project from the drop-down. Then click Submit. You will receive confirmation from the system that your package has been submitted. If you return to the project overview page, you will see that the board action is now pending review. The submission is now in the IRB's queue for processing. Next, we will submit the UC Davis package so it can be reviewed with the study-wide package. Completing the UC Davis package in IRBNet. Click on the link for the UC Davis package. You will land on the project overview page. To add documents to your package, go to the Designer page. The navigation button is found on the left-hand side of the screen. Once on the Designer page, click Start a Wizard and select UC Davis Initial Review Application. You should create a new wizard from scratch and click Continue. You will start on the General Instructions page. This page has a helpful link to the Initial Review Application Guide that takes you through each step of the initial review application at your own pace. You can leave the initial review application before it has been completed. Click the Save and Exit button at the bottom of the screen to leave the application. The next page is the PI attestation. When signing this package, the PI is attesting to all items written here. This is the administrative approval page. In general, the UC Davis package will need the department chair's electronic signature. This page outlines situations where a signature other than the department chair's is needed. The Principal Investigator information page is next. Complete the PI's information, indicate if the PI will be involved in the consent process, and select Yes for UC Davis Investigator. On the Co-Principal Investigator page, indicate if there is a UC Davis co-PI for this study. External PIs should not be listed as co-PI here. On the Primary Contact page, select Yes if the UC Davis PI will handle responses to requests from our IRB. If there is a study coordinator that will be taking care of responses, please select No and enter the coordinator's information on the next page. On the Review Information page, select No for UC Davis IRB Relying. Select Yes for UC Davis IRB Reviewing. If you have additional study personnel, select Yes and add their information on the following pages. If you do not have any additional study personnel, select No. On the Outside Financial Interest page, answer the question regarding significant financial interests. A link to more information can be found at the bottom of the page. Answer the questions on the Protocol Information page. On the Funding Information page, it will provide you with the sponsor the Reliance team entered for you in IRBNet. If the sponsor listed is incorrect, or there are additional sponsors that were not listed, you will need to leave the wizard to correct it. Click the Save and Exit button to exit the wizard. This will bring you back to the Designer page. Click the Project Overview button on the left-hand side of the screen. At the top of the Project Overview page, click on the yellow Edit link. Update the sponsor line. For this example, NIH funding is no longer pending, so the study team removed the pending notification next to NIH. Click the Save button. You are now on the Project Overview page. Click on the Designer button on the left-hand side of the screen. To return to the initial review application, click on the pencil icon to the right of the initial review application. We're taken back to the Funding Information page. If you had continued to answer questions and need to go back to this page, you can use the drop-down at the top of the screen to navigate to the page you need to update. Select the page you want to move to, and then click Jump. Now that the funding information has been corrected, select the checkbox or boxes for the type of funding. If you have a grant, you'll be taken to the grant information page to provide additional information about the grant or grants. For multiple grants, use the Add Another Grant button at the bottom of the page. Answer the question on the UC Davis Health Billing Compliance page. If none of the research will be conducted at UC Davis Health, you can select No. Describe the UC Davis site's research setting and resources on the Research Location Information page. The relying sites will answer these questions for their site in the initial review application on their site projects. Only list locations that the UC Davis PI will have oversight of and resources that are UC Davis specific. For external sites, if the UC Davis PI will conduct or oversee research activities at sites outside UC Davis where there is no local PI, select Yes. Otherwise, select No. If you select Yes, the next page will collect information on the external site or sites. On the multi-site page, select Yes, since this study will have more than one site under more than one PI. On the UC Davis Clinical and Translational Science Center page, indicate if the study has CTSC support. The Ancillary Review page will ask you questions about ancillary reviews that may be needed for the UC Davis site. It also lists when decision letters from those committees need to be included in the submission. On the Recruitment Information page, mark any recruitment methods being used for the study at UC Davis. If the study is a clinical trial at UC Davis, include the email address of the UC Davis study team's primary contact for subject recruitment under the study page's contact. If you are using protected health information, check all boxes that apply to the UC Davis site on the HIPAA page. If you indicated a HIPAA waiver is needed, the wizard will present you with the Waiver of HIPAA Authorization page. Please note, you do not need to check all boxes under the HIPAA waiver rationale section, only the ones that are true for the UC Davis site. Indicate if the UC Davis site will use screening scripts prior to consent on the screening script page. On the consent page, check all consent processes that will be used at the UC Davis site for this study. If you indicated that an information sheet or oral consent will be used at the UC Davis site, the wizard will present you with additional questions to answer. If you indicated there will be no consent process, the wizard will include the No Consent Process page to complete. Please only select the checkboxes that are true for the UC Davis site. The consent language page asks if the UC Davis site will possibly enroll participants who are unable to speak or read English. If you select that the UC Davis site will enroll non-English speakers, you will be taken to the Language Barriers page. Answer the questions for the UC Davis site only. If you indicate that you will not enroll non-English speakers at the UC Davis site, you will be taken to the Non-English Information page where you will need to provide a justification for not including these subjects in the study. Complete the Compensation for Participation page with the plan for the UC Davis site. The next few pages collect information on drugs and biologics, medical devices, international research, and safety and compliance monitoring. On the Number of Participants page, enter the number of participants you plan to enroll at UC Davis. The next two pages are Vulnerable Populations and Targeted Participants. Depending on your selections on each page, the wizard may ask for additional information. List what will be done at the UC Davis site on the Data Confidentiality page. The Form Complete page will list additional documents that should be uploaded into your submission, such as ancillary committee decision letters. Click Save and Exit on the bottom of the screen to return to the Designer page. On the Designer page, you will upload the rest of your documents using the Attach New Document button at the bottom of the screen. After all documents have been uploaded to the package, the UC Davis PI and the department chair both need to sign the package. The PI should log into IRBNet, open this package, use the Sign This Package button on the left-hand side of the screen, select Principal Investigator from the drop-down, and click Sign. The process is the same for the department chair. The chair logs into IRBNet, opens this package, uses the Sign This Package button on the left-hand side of the screen, selects Department Head, and then clicks Sign. After the PI and department chair have signed the UC Davis package, the package can be submitted to our IRB by clicking the Submit This Package button on the left-hand side of the screen. By default, the UC Davis IRB is selected. Click Continue. For submission type, select New Project from the drop-down, then click Submit. You will receive confirmation from the system that your package has been submitted. If you return to the project overview page, you will see that the board action is now pending review. The submission is now in the IRB's queue for processing. The study-wide and UC Davis packages will move to review together. Completing the Relying Site package in IRBNet. For externally funded research, the link for the Relying Site package, you will land on the project overview page. This package has not been submitted, so is listed as work in progress. At the bottom of the page, you will see a list of the projects that are linked for this study. Now you can see that the new Relying Site, as well as the UC Davis and study-wide projects, are listed. To complete the initial review application, go to the Designer page. The navigation button is found on the left-hand side of the screen. Once on the Designer page, click on the pencil icon to the right of the UC Davis Initial Review application. You will start on the PI Attestation page. Please click the Previous button at the bottom of the page to start on the General Instructions page. This page has a helpful link to the Initial Review Application Guide that takes you through each step of the Initial Review application at your own pace. You can leave the initial review application before it has been completed. Click the Save and Exit button at the bottom of the screen to leave the application. The next page is the PI attestation. When signing this package, the PI is attesting to all items written here. This is the administrative approval page. This page does not apply to the Relying Site. These requirements are addressed by the Relying IRB during the reliance process. The Principal Investigator Information page is next. Complete the PI's information. For PI department, if your department is not listed, scroll to the bottom of the drop-down and select Other. Then type your department under PI Department Other. Indicate if the PI will be involved in the consent process, and select No for UC Davis Investigator. The non-UCD PI information page is where you will fill in the Relying PI's institution and their institution or organization's federal-wide assurance number. If you do not know your FWA, please ask your local IRB or the UC Davis Reliance team member you've been working with. On the Co-Principal Investigator page, indicate if there was a co-PI for this Relying Site for this study. PIs from other sites, such as UC Davis, should not be listed as co-PI here. On the Primary Contact page, select Yes if the Relying PI will handle responses to requests from the UC Davis IRB. If there's a study coordinator that will be taking care of responses, please select No and enter the coordinator's information on the next page. On the Review Information page, select No for UC Davis Relying. Select Yes for UC Davis IRB Reviewing. On the Outside Financial Interest page, answer the question regarding significant financial interests. A link to more information can be found at the bottom of the page. If you have a significant financial interest, include your institution's conflict of interest determination and management plan with your submission. Answer the questions on the Protocol Information page. On the Funding Information page, it will provide you with the sponsor the Reliance team entered for you in IRBNet. Select the checkbox or boxes for the type of funding. If you have a grant, you'll be taken to the grant information page to provide additional information about the grant or grants. Describe the Relying Site's research setting and resources on the Research Location Information page. Answer these questions for your site only. Only list locations that the Relying PI will have oversight of and resources that are specific to this Relying site. For external sites, if the Relying PI will conduct or oversee research activities at sites outside the Relying site where there is no local PI, select Yes. Otherwise, select No. If you select Yes, the next page will collect information on the external site or sites. On the multi-site page, select Yes, since the study will have more than one site under more than one PI. On the Recruitment Information page, mark any recruitment methods being used for the study at the Relying site. The study page's contact section is only for the UC Davis site and should be left blank. If you are using protected health information, check all boxes that apply to the Relying site on the HIPAA page. If you indicated a HIPAA waiver is needed, the wizard will present you with the Waiver of HIPAA Authorization page. Indicate if the Relying site will use screening scripts prior to consent on the screening script page. On the consent page, check all consent processes that will be used at the Relying site for this study. If you indicated that an information sheet or oral consent will be used at the Relying site, the wizard will present you with additional questions to answer. If you indicated that there will be no consent process, the wizard will include the No Consent Process page to complete. Please only select the checkboxes that are true for the Relying site. The consent language page asks if the Relying site will possibly enroll participants who are unable to speak or read English. If you select that the Relying site will enroll non-English speakers, you will be taken to the Language Barriers page. Answer the questions for the Relying site. If you indicate that you will not enroll non-English speakers at the Relying site, you will be taken to the non-English information page, where you will need to provide a justification for not including these subjects in the study. Complete the Compensation for Participation page with the plan for the Relying site. The next few pages collect information on drugs and biologics, medical devices, international research, and safety and compliance monitoring. On the Number of Participants page, enter the number of participants you plan to enroll at the Relying site. The next two pages are vulnerable populations and targeted participants. Depending on your selections on each page, the wizard may ask for additional information. List what will be done at the Relying site on the Data Confidentiality page. The Form Complete page will list additional documents that should be uploaded into your submission, such as the Relying PI CV. Some of the items listed will not apply to the Relying site submission because they are addressed in the study-wide submission. Click Save and Exit on the bottom of the screen to return to the Designer page. On the Designer page, you will upload the rest of your documents using the Attach New Document button at the bottom of the screen. After all documents have been uploaded to the package, the Relying PI needs to sign the package. After the PI has signed the package can be submitted to our IRB by clicking the Submit This Package button on the left-hand side of the screen. Search for Davis. Select UC Davis IRB Administration, Davis, California, and click Continue. For submission type, select New Project from the drop-down. Then click Submit. You will receive confirmation from the system that your package has been submitted. If you return to the Project Overview page, you will see that the board action is now pending review. The submission is now in the IRB's queue for processing.
Great. So we'll pause for some questions. I saw one in the chat about continuing reviews. But we were going to get to continuing reviews now. So we'll hold off on that one. But if there are any other questions, please let Janae know, since she's answering the questions today.
Let's see. And I'm going to save yours till the end of the presentation, if you don't mind. And I'm just looking at Eric's now. Eric said, if we have a grant with a good score, but have not gotten the notice of award, when should we start the reliance process if there are multiple sites involved? It really depends. And that's the answer a lot with reliances. If this is a federal grant, a lot of times you want to be talking to us before you're even submitting it, just so we kind of have the heads up. The other IRBs, you've talked to them and they are also willing to rely on us as the IRB. So we won't necessarily put the agreements in place, but we might, depending on what, how likely everyone feels it is that it's going to be funded. The other thing we can do is a lot of times we will approve the study-wide and Davis submissions and then move on to add other relying sites after the award has been issued, after we know those other sites have funding. Does that answer your question, Eric?
For the most part, yes, we're right in the middle of this process right now. So Dr. Holmes and Dr. Cooperman have submitted a grant. It looks pretty good. We don't know if we're going to get that, but we've gotten that 60-day notice. So I was just wondering when I should start this process.
I mean, you're certainly, Christy, do you want to jump in about reliance fees?
I'm also covering them at the end.
We've gotten that 60-day notice. So I was just wondering when I should start this process.
I mean, you're certainly, Christy, do you want to jump in about reliance fees?
I'm also covering them at the end.
Okay, I was just making sure those are going to be covered.
Sorry, so Eric, to go back, you can certainly ask us to set it up and have it ready to go if you want. And then once you have funding, then we can have it ready to move forward a little bit faster. And that gives us, then we don't have to scramble quite as much, especially since this one sounds like it's pretty likely that it's going to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Just trying to give you guys as much time as possible too.
We appreciate that.
All right, any other questions? Okay, we'll have time for questions at the end. And I'm just going to ask again, can everyone see my presentation screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about post-approval submissions as they are related to the reliance process. So just as a reminder of what the different post-approval submission types are, we have modifications, we have reportable events, we have continuing reviews or annual reviews, and then closures. So we'll start off with modifications. Now here's something that's a little bit interesting about reliance studies is that you can essentially break down these modifications into two types. So we have study-wide modifications, and we also have site-specific modifications. So for these projects, it's important to ask if a modification affects all sites, i.e. is it a study-wide modification or only one site or a set of sites? So is it site-specific? An example of a study-wide modification would be a protocol amendment that will be implemented at all participating sites, whereas an example of a site-specific modification would be if the site-specific consent form was translated into, like, say, another language like Spanish, and it needs to be submitted for approval, but it's just that site's consent form, their own specific local one. So we're going to, just as a reminder, so when we say site-specific, that includes the UC Davis project and the non-UC Davis site-specific project. So essentially, it's important to remember that in some ways, it's like the UC Davis site is a participating site in this project, even though they're like the lead site. So when we say site-specific, that doesn't just mean the external sites, that also can include UC Davis. So just want to make sure that vocabulary is explained. So we'll start with the study-wide submissions, or study-wide modifications. So for the study-wide modification, when you're looking at the study-wide project, this is what you're going to have to do. The person who is responsible is going to be the UC Davis study team. And the procedure is going to be on the study-wide project. You're going to complete the post-approval submission form. You're going to upload marked and cleaned study-wide documents. You're going to have the UC Davis PI provide signature, but not the other PIs, just the UC Davis PI. And as far as timing goes for this, if this is something that's going to be obviously approvable, then you may submit simultaneously the UC Davis project and the non-UC Davis site-specific, or you may submit it simultaneously with the UC Davis project and the non-UC Davis site-specific projects. So you would be submitting that umbrella study-wide project in conjunction with these other site-specific projects, the UC Davis and non-UC Davis ones. If you think that this is a modification where changes might be requested, it's probably best to submit the study-wide submission first, and then submit the other ones. Oops. So now for study-wide modifications and specifically the site-specific projects, who's going to be responsible for submitting those? That's going to be the UC Davis study team if it involves and the external sites. So you have that umbrella submission that you already did, and now we're doing like all the different individual sites. So the procedure for that is on the site-specific project, you're going to include a post-approval submission form, the marked and clean versions of site-specific documents. So you shouldn't be uploading the ones that you already uploaded to the study-wide submission. These are specific how these different site-specific documents were changed. So kind of think of an example. Say you added or say you changed a particular blood draw from a basic metabolic panel to a complete metabolic panel. Well, that's a study-wide modification because it's going to affect all of the sites. So you have submitted that protocol change in the actual study-wide submission, the umbrella one. But maybe each consent form mentioned what blood test you were actually doing. And so each site's specific consent form is also going to have to be modified. So that's where this sort of thing comes into play and why you have to also possibly be changing some site-specific documentation. Each site's principal investigator is going to also provide signature. Another hot tip, you can copy the study-wide post-approval submission form, but make sure that any site-specific information is edited. So don't just submit the same post-approval submission form for each site-specific project. Each one should be you should really ensure that they have that site-specific information in it. So at this point, you might be asking yourself a question. So what if my study-wide modification does not affect any site-specific documents or forms? So it's no other forms or the initial review application or anything like that does not actually need to be edited. So what do you do? Well, then it's easy peasy lemon squeezy. You do not need to submit any site-specific modifications in that case. You can get away with just submitting that umbrella study-wide project. You don't have to have any sort of site-specific project submitted as well. So now we're going to go on to the second type of modifications, which are the site-specific modifications. So remember that was our example where we had a translated site-specific consent form. So for site-specific modifications to a study-wide, the changes you have to make to the study-wide project are none. So who is responsible? Nobody. And procedures, nothing. You're not going to actually touch the study-wide project at all if you have a site-specific modification. Now, if you have a site-specific modification, you are going to have to edit the site-specific project. So who's going to be responsible for that? That's going to be any of the sites making those changes. So that could include UC Davis. Procedures for that, you're going to edit, once again, I keep on saying this, it's just don't get your wires crossed, the site-specific project. So you're going to include the post-approval submission form. Remember that dummy post-approval submission form was already created for each site in IRBnet by the IRB Reliance team. So they should have access to, your relying sites should have access to this form. You're going to have them upload marked and clean versions of the site-specific document. follow the UC Davis IRB policies and procedures in regards to reportable events. Just as a reminder, those policies and procedures can be found in our investigator manual. So this includes what requires reporting, what actually needs to be reported, the reporting time frame. So does this need to be reported in 5 business days or 10 business days? And the mechanisms for reporting, as in you're going to report via IRBnet. You're not just going to send an email to our director about your R&I and assume that that means that you're good to go. If something is not reportable per the UC Davis IRB policies, but the relying site's IRB is like, hey, you need to still submit this to the UC Davis IRB. This is something that we're requiring. Then the UC Davis IRB will still review that type of reportable event, even though it doesn't meet our reporting guidelines. However, it's important that the relying sites know that they're responsible for compliance with those rules. That's not something we're not going to say, oh yeah, I know that Duke requires reporting to the lead site, even if it's this particular event doesn't meet the reporting guidelines. It's not UC Davis's job to be policing the other institutions. So it's that relying site coordinator's responsibility to know and be compliant with those local policies. And relying sites may be required, as I just said, by their local institutions to provide additional reports to local officials, i.e. to their own local IRB. And once again, the relying sites are responsible for compliance with those rules. There's just no way that we'd be able to know what every rule as far as reportable events are at every other university. So our expectation and what we look for is that the policies and procedures specific to UC Davis are followed for all relying sites. So just like with modifications, these reportable events can be broken up into 2 groups, ones that are study-wide reportable events and then ones that are site-specific. Once again, site-specific includes UC Davis and the non-UC Davis site-specific project. So how do you report a study-wide reportable event? So that's going to be something that affects all sites. So that could be like an investigator's brochure update, a study hold. For some reason, everyone decided to be non-compliant with the rules and regulations of research, or some sort of report from the sponsor that affects all sites. The UC Davis study team will be the one responsible for reporting those sorts of events. And the procedures for that would be in the study-wide project, you're going to have the post-approval submission form. You're going to upload any relevant documents. As a reminder, the bottom of the post-approval submission form will tell you what needs to be submitted. And no changes need to be made to the site-specific projects because this is a study-wide reportable event. It's not something that's only affecting one site. So for reportable events that are site-specific, meaning that it happened at one site or a couple of sites, but not a study-wide issue, the person who's responsible for submitting these are the site where that reportable event occurred. So if the University of Florida had some sort of event that was reportable to the UC Davis IRB, so like some sort of like local non-compliance with the protocol that resulted in harm to a subject, something like that, that would need to be reported to us within that like 5 business day timeline. But it needs to be reported on a site-specific level. So they'll edit the site-specific project. Once again, they're going to complete a post-approval submission form. They're going to upload any relevant documents, which that list is at the bottom of the post-approval. The second type of modifications, which are the site-specific modifications. So remember that was our example where we had a translated site-specific consent form. So for site-specific modifications to a study-wide, the changes you have to make to the study-wide project are none. So who is responsible? Nobody. And procedures, nothing. You're not going to actually touch the study-wide project at all if you have a site-specific modification. Now, if you have a site-specific modification, you are going to have to edit the site-specific project. So who's going to be responsible for that? That's going to be any of the sites making those changes. So that could include UC Davis. Procedures for that, you're going to edit, once again, I keep on saying this, it's just don't get your wires crossed, the site-specific project. So you're going to include the post-approval submission form. Remember that dummy post-approval submission form was already created for each site in IRBnet by the IRB Reliance team. So they should have access to, your relying sites should have access to this form. You're going to have them upload marked and clean versions of the site-specific document. follow the UC Davis IRB policies and procedures in regards to reportable events. Just as a reminder, those policies and procedures can be found in our investigator manual. So this includes what requires reporting, what actually needs to be reported, the reporting time frame. So does this need to be reported in 5 business days or 10 business days? And the mechanisms for reporting, as in you're going to report via IRBnet. You're not just going to send an email to our director about your R&I and assume that that means that you're good to go. If something is not reportable per the UC Davis IRB policies, but the relying sites IRB is like, hey, you need to still submit this to the UC Davis IRB. This is something that we're requiring. Then the UC Davis IRB will still review that type of reportable event, even though it doesn't meet our reporting guidelines. However, it's important that the relying sites know that they're responsible for compliance with those rules. That's not something we're not going to say, oh yeah, I know that Duke requires reporting to the lead site, even if it's this particular event doesn't meet the reporting guidelines. It's not UC Davis's job to be policing the other institutions. So it's that relying site coordinator's responsibility to know and be compliant with those local policies. And relying sites may be required, as I just said, by their local institutions to provide additional reports to local officials, i.e. to their own local IRB. And once again, the relying sites are responsible for compliance with those rules. There's just no way that we'd be able to know what every rule as far as reportable events are at every other university. So our expectation and what we look for is that the policies and procedures specific to UC Davis are followed for all relying sites. So just like with modifications, these reportable events can be broken up into 2 groups, ones that are study-wide reportable events and then ones that are site-specific. Once again, site-specific includes UC Davis and the non-UC Davis site-specific project. So how do you report a study-wide reportable event? So that's going to be something that affects all sites. So that could be like an investigator's brochure update, a study hold. For some reason, everyone decided to be non-compliant with the rules and regulations of research, or some sort of report from the sponsor that affects all sites. The UC Davis study team will be the one responsible for reporting those sorts of events. And the procedures for that would be in the study-wide project, you're going to have the post-approval submission form. You're going to upload any relevant documents. As a reminder, the bottom of the post-approval submission form will tell you what needs to be submitted. And no changes need to be made to the site-specific projects because this is a study-wide reportable event. It's not something that's only affecting one site. So for reportable events that are site-specific, meaning that it happened at one site or a couple of sites, but not a study-wide issue, the person who's responsible for submitting these are the site where that reportable event occurred. So if the University of Florida had some sort of event that was reportable to the UC Davis IRB, so like some sort of like local non-compliance with the protocol that resulted in harm to a subject, something like that, that would need to be reported to us within that like 5 business day timeline. But it needs to be reported on a site-specific level. So they'll edit the site-specific project. Once again, they're going to complete a post-approval submission form. They're going to upload any relevant documents, which that list is at the bottom of the post-approval submission form. And they're not going to make any changes to the study-wide project, because remember, this happened at that specific site. So there's not any study-wide reportable events that need to be reported. So we're going to talk about continuing reviews now. So for continuing reviews, there's not like a study-wide and version of a continuing review and then a local version of a continuing review. Just every a continuing review is just going to be for like the whole project. So for the study-wide project, the UC Davis team is responsible for completing the study, that actual study-wide submission. So there's gonna be no post-approval submission form here. And any documents that would normally be submitted as part of a continuing review that apply to all sites will be submitted in this package. So that includes any interim findings or any data safety monitoring board or data safety monitoring committee reports. And then the UC Davis principal investigator will sign. Now, if there's no documents, so there's no interim findings, there's no DSMB or DSMC reports, then a PI signature is not required because there's no point in having them sign a blank package. So that's what the study-wide umbrella project is going to look like for your continuing review. What the different site-specific projects are going to look like. Well, first off, I just say that the UC Davis study team and the external sites are responsible for getting those submitted. And the procedures are, on the site-specific project, you are going to have a post-approval submission form. You are going to include documents that would normally be submitted as part of continuing review that only apply to that site. So the best example of that is, say that there's a monitoring report for each site. Each site is going to submit their own personal monitoring report. So if a monitor came out and monitored that site, then that's where, this is the package where this would be submitted. That site's principal investigator is going to sign. And that's it. Just as a reminder, this includes the UC Davis site-specific project. So when you are submitting a continuing review, you're going to have that study-wide submission, and then you're also going to have every site submit their continuing review too. And then lastly, we have closures. So for closures, once again, this does not really get split into two different types. There's not like site-specific and study-wide closures. The study is just closing. So for the site-specific project, the person who's responsible for submitting that is going to be the UC Davis study team and the external sites. So the UC Davis study team will be submitting the UC Davis project, and the external sites will be submitting their own. And if you noticed here, I reversed the order. We went site specific before we went study wide, and there's a reason for that, and you'll see why in a moment. And then the procedures for that are, in the site specific project, you're going to include a post-approval submission form. You're going to include the documents that would normally be submitted as part of a closure that only apply to that site. So once again, the monitoring reports are probably the best example of that. And then that's, whoops. And it should say here that it should have the PI signature as well. I should correct that. So that site's PI signature should also sign this form as well. And then for the study-wide project for closures, who's responsible? This is actually going to be the UC Davis study team and the UC Davis IRB Reliance team. And here's why. So on the study-wide project, there's going to be no post-approval submission form. So it's very similar to the process for continuing reviews. And you're going to submit those documents that would normally be submitted as part of a closure that apply to all sites. So that includes any sort of publications resulting from the research. That's probably the best example. And then you're going to have the UC Davis principal investigator sign. And if there's no documents, then the PI signature is not going to be required. And the reason why this was second to the site-specific project is because once all of the site-specific projects are closed out, then the study-wide project will be administratively closed out. So it's not something that necessarily takes a lot of extra work. So we finished all the different post-approval submission types, and some of you, like Christy, kind of pointed out when I said, hey, what about fees? Because we don't do this for free. So the fee structure for Reliance studies is relatively complicated because it depends on your funding source or funding sources. It depends on when those funding sources were initiated or released. So it actually depends on certain dates of when we had certain policies. So honestly, the easiest thing to do is use our fee form calculator, which is both on our IRB fees page and on our single IRB and Reliance's web pages on the IRB website. And this is a Qualtrics form that we made that allows you to say, okay, I'm receiving this type of funding. This is when this funding was released, or this was when this grant was we obtained this grant. And then it will tell you exactly the fees that need to be used, what fee forms to use, because there's a specific Reliance fee form. And it will also tell you if you have to upload the fee form at initial review and at continuing review, or only at initial review. So it gives you all that information. It's like a very complicated kind of process figuring that out, but using the fee form calculator will be at initial review and at continuing review will help you to know when you need to submit those things. And I suppose you should probably do that beforehand, because if you're creating a budget for your project, then it's important for you to know what fees are going to be due when. So definitely start early on that and use our fee form calculator. It's the best resource that we have as far as these fees are concerned. And they'll tell you, once again, when to upload these things. And then speaking of our website, we are working right now on our single IRB and Reliance's page, and it will actually include some clips from this recording. So this training is being recorded, and so we will use some of the clips from this. And we're also going to have the video that Janae made up on our website too. And we are trying to make this a little bit of a clearer and more process-driven page than it has previously been. And so now I'm done. And if you have any questions, you can ask them now. You can also contact hs-irbreliance@ucdavis.edu or hs-irbeducation@ucdavis.edu. That's our general education line that you can always contact whenever you are interested in doing so. So I'm going to end the slideshow and let people ask any questions that they might have.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and also Janae for your presentation that was pre-recorded. Yes, if you have questions, go ahead and unmute yourself or put your question into the chat and we'll be happy to take your questions.
I know Anna had a question that we kind of pushed to the end of the presentation. I know Stephanie went over the annual review process here for single IRB. I don't know if that covered that part of your question or if you wanted, if you had an additional question on top of that.
That covered it.
Okay, you're welcome. And then as far as the relying site IRBs having responsibility at the annual review when we're the IRB, they technically are not, we're the IRB of record, so they are not the reviewing IRBs. However, some IRBs will require their local sites to submit copies of, say, our annual approval or even mod forms. So knowing what that relying IRB is going to require of their site is nice, especially if you're acting as their coordinator. It's nice to know that they're going to be expecting those to be submitted, either so you can give that PI a heads up, or just so you're expecting it. And then Erica is asking, can you discuss timelines for Reliance submissions, also turnaround times when UC Davis seeds review? The timelines for Reliance submissions, it really varies. There are a lot of moving pieces for Reliances. Our office, the Reliance team here, we usually try to be very responsive and review things and get them out to you pretty quick. But if we're setting up a Reliance, we can sometimes run into issues with the other IRB, or if we have to go through legal on the other side, or if for some reason their contract is held up on their sponsor programs and their IRB won't sign off until that's done, that can make the timeline much longer. So it's really hard to predict timelines. We say it could be weeks to months. And then turnaround times when we seed, once again, we're usually pretty quick on our side as far as reviewing and getting out our comments. But if the sponsor starts fighting with you on the revisions we've asked for, or the other IRB, we can't agree on the contract, again, legal's getting involved, that can draw out the process. Some ways to kind of cut down the time, if we're both using something like Smart IRB, which we've already signed on to, and the other IRB is already signed on to, that can make that part of the process go a lot faster because we're not negotiating a new agreement for the Reliance. And that's happening before we even get into the review piece of it. Does that address everything, Erica?
Yeah, thank you. What about like Advera? If that's like, I know one of the regularly used ones, is that usually speedier?
It's usually pretty quick. Again, it depends on the sponsor. I've had sponsors that drag their feet like crazy, yes. Because, and I would say if we ask for a change in the language and they start fighting you on it, copy us in on that, because the Reliance team will we'll be happy to be part of that conversation with the sponsors, because we know this is our language, this is why it has to be included. And sometimes having that come from our office instead of making the coordinator be the middleman on that, sometimes that can help. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes they dig in. But being on the same page and kind of knowing the conversations that are happening in the background can help us help you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I have an Advera Reliance coming through in the next couple of weeks, hopefully into your office. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Janae, I see you have a fan here in the chat, so we'll just toot your horn a little bit here. But Jennifer has said that Janae has been so amazing with their big project, and thank you, Janae and team. And so I'm so glad that you were able to be a part of today's presentation as well, being able to give another set of eyes and knowledge with the topic. And Stephanie as well, you've done such an amazing job. We do still want to take questions. We have about another 14 minutes for this class. If you do want to ask more questions or just even brainstorm or soundboard, always a good thing to do while you have so many people here to help you.
Yeah, and I just want to give a quick shout out to Christy, who's also on the Reliance team, and Carmen, who I don't think is on the call, but she's also part of the Reliance team. When you email us and use the Reliance inbox, the three of us are the ones who monitor that account. And it's usually better to email that rather than doing one of us directly, because if, let's say, I'm out or someone's out sick all of a sudden, then the rest of us know what's going on and kind of jump in and say, okay, hey, this person's out, let me help you with that. So I would definitely recommend communicating with us through the Reliance inbox rather than through our personal emails. You can certainly email us there, but if you copy the Reliance box, then the rest of us are in the loop if we need to step in.
That's great advice. Thank you. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I can go ahead and end the recording now.